I want to take a moment to introduce the panel members who you have not met yet, at least on stage. So you know Amanda Cattermole and Eden Bruckman, and you're nicely sitting in the same order as my notes. Appreciate that. Janet Noodleman, right here, has 30 years experience working on sort of the social change arena as an organizer and lobbyist on women's health issues. And she currently coordinates the Breast Cancer Fund's campaign for safe cosmetics and the Cans Not Cancer campaign. She has a master's degree in public policy, which informs her work. And Meredith Williams, sitting to her left, joined the Department of Toxic Substances Control in 2013 to oversee the implementation of California's Safer Consumer Products Program, and has had vast experience in the last 3 years in that realm. Her doctoral degree is actually originally in physics, so she could teach me quite a few things. And past Eden is John O'Keefe, who has been working in the food industry for nearly 30 years. He's currently at Amy's Kitchen, where he's been for the last 10 years, and is currently acting as Director of Regulatory Affairs there. So I have asked the folks who have not yet presented today if they wouldn't mind providing a few thoughts on the goal of this last session is to try to integrate a bit of the wide range of material that we've covered today along the lines of answering the question, how do you change a material? If you have one material that you want to get out of and you want to either find safer alternatives or implement a safer alternative, we've all seen sort of a tour through how complex that question is from how many different respects. And so I wanted to just take this hour to think together about how that is successfully done and what some of the best leverage points are and how to overcome some of the obstacles. So that's the challenge to these panelists, and those who haven't spoken already are going to give a brief addition, and then we'll open it up for a conversation.
Well, thank you, Meg, very much, and everyone from Green Chemistry, the Green Chemistry Center, and OEHA, and Cali PA, and FDA, and it sounds like just about everyone both was involved in putting together this convening, and lots of great stakeholders are here participating. So I'm really pleased to be a part of this. So my perspective is that of the consumer advocate. And I'd like to just add a little bit to what I heard today. There's lots of really important takeaways. I think one of the major point that I'd like to make, however, is that there are key points of intervention throughout the supply chain. And that's kind of an obvious statement. But the interventions exist within the entire supply chain, and I believe everyone can be a part of the solution. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the food manufacturers or the brand owners. We don't really think that it's enough for manufacturers to just be complying with the regulations that exist. I mean, what we heard today from the FDA regulator is there isn't the kind of disclosure or transparency that we'd like from the FDA, and we know as safe food packaging advocates that there is not the full battery of toxicological tests that we'd like to see there either. And companies like Valspar decided to go above and beyond what was being required of them by the FDA. That is exactly what we'd like to say to the rest of the industry and to the food brands, is you should be reaching for a high bar of safety, a higher bar of safety than what the regulatory agencies are asking from you. And you should be looking to the community, both of advocates as well as consumers, for what that high bar should look like. What was really interesting to me about Mark's discussion is when someone asked the question, why did you look at mammary gland endpoints and endocrine disruption, even though the FDA is not requiring that of you? And what Mark didn't say, but what Tom said to us when they came to meet with the Breast Cancer Fund, is that they didn't want to create another BPA to replace BPA in food packaging. And if they had followed the requirements of the FDA in terms of their toxicological testing, that's what they could have ended up doing. So instead, they looked to the community to hear what was the court of public opinion saying to them. And what they were hearing from advocates like us is we were concerned about estrogenicity, about chemicals that act like hormones, about endocrine disruption, about mammary gland endpoints. And they decided to go ahead and look for those endpoints. Not, again, because regulation was telling them they had to, but because it was the right thing to do. And they wanted to apply a higher level of safety to the new can material, the new lining material that they were planning, that they were in the process of developing. So that kind of expectation can be applied along the supply chain, rising to the highest standard, raising a higher bar for safety. Suppliers can do that, like Valspar demonstrated. Food brands can make that expectation of their suppliers. Consumers are asking for it. Trade associations can be facilitators of these conversations. They can be agents of change. They can be resources and repository of information and best practices for the food brands that they represent. So I think I'll stop there.
So I've seen a lot of familiar faces in the room today, so I'm going to presume that a lot of you are familiar with the Safer Consumer Products Program and those regulations, and I know that a number of you are not. But what I will point to is the third step of the 4 steps in our regulations, which requires an alternatives analysis. And so this is an issue that we've been thinking about in the program for quite some time, which is how do you do an alternatives analysis? And so throughout the day, I kept reflecting on what it takes to do that kind of analysis, given what we were hearing today. And the theme that came up over and over again in many different ways was just the complexity, the level of complexity involved in making these decisions. And we heard about the complexity in the supply chain. We heard about the complexity in the different functionality requirements. We heard about the complexity in the toxicology, et cetera. And so what we didn't talk about, but what we saw and saw demonstrated throughout the day was the decision-making process that people are using. And in some ways, this was a very nice day to consider a case study around alternatives analysis, because people were making decisions in the face of that complexity, in the face of wanting more data, in the face of having to make some very difficult trade-offs. And so, for instance, if you look at the different tools we saw demonstrated today, there were decisions made about whether or not someone was going through a screening process or whether they were making that final decision for between the last few options, or whether they were which of their functional requirements was more important to them than another functional requirement. And so, we constantly people are quite at least intimidated by the Safer Consumer Products alternatives analysis process. But in fact, what I heard today tells me that people are already pretty far down the road of thinking about these things. Now, it was not the full range of complexity that we asked for. For instance, I was so happy to hear someone mention the waste stream. And we can add in those different parts of the life cycle, and that just adds additional complexity to things. But I did see evidence here today that people do know how to make decisions in the face of all the different puts and takes that they have to make in order to make their products work.
Yeah, complexity is the word, I think. For us at Amy's Kitchen, we try to do the right thing, obviously. We try to be very proactive. We try to respond to our consumers. And back in early 2010 and maybe earlier, a few consumers were mentioning to us about epoxy liners and their concerns about BPA. So we were one of the early converts to a non-BPA liner. And we had we had to learn about it. We didn't know all the chemistry, and I came here to learn also because I'm still not fully understanding everything there is, especially on the chemistry side and the migration tests and the toxicity. But we focused on initially where it intersects with us, which is we needed a replacement can. We knew we didn't want an epoxy can anymore. But it had to meet our basic requirements, like we cook at a higher temperature than a lot of people that run retorts cook at. We needed the material to coat correctly. We needed to know that at least the materials that were being used, and we knew they were FDA approved. And so once we got those basic things out of the way and to our satisfaction, then really the plant trial starts, the trials really, which are very complex. We have about 45 or so different products. Some of them are acid products like tomato soups. Some of them are beans. They're all vegetarian, but they all have different characteristics. There were a number of different liners that we had to consider, and how each liner interacted with each product, and all the trials you could imagine would add up. And we ended up, I think there was some discussion about how some coatings work good for the can, but they don't work so good for the end because you have a pull tab. We ran into all those kind of complexities. So once we finished that analysis, which took several months, we had about 3 or 4, I think, different acrylics that we were looking at. We had a polyester end because the acrylics don't coat very well on the end, apparently, at least from the people we were working with. And we had oleoresin, which someone mentioned. We looked at vinyl, but it doesn't hold up in the temperatures that we cook at. It coats the can great, apparently, but it would just melt off if we used it. So, so the second part of that, after all that is done, of course, is safety. It's paramount for us. Is the integrity of the can going to hold up over months and years? And we did the studies that were talked about. We did the incubation studies, both at our can supplier and in-house. And the process took over 2 years to put up several products. So just imagine you make 10 cases of one soup in one liner, or in 5 different alternate liners, and you have maybe 40 or 45 soups to go through. That's a lot of trials. It's a lot of tasting. It's a lot of opening cans. It's a lot of logistics. And when you fail, you have to go back and try another liner and another combination. So it's a lot of work. And the third factor for us, which turned out to be the most complex, really, was flavor, and was the quality of the product, the look of the product, the flavor. We have a group, a very large group of people that are our culinary group. And that's like the last hurdle in a lot of these trials, is to get past that culinary and that sensory profile. If you make a tomato soup, it has to taste the same in the old liner as it did in the new liner. We had other considerations. We knew that some of the analogs we were aware of, like BPS, we needed to make sure that those weren't in the liner. So I do sympathize when people say how difficult it is, because we lived through it. And we had an accelerated program, believe it or not, and a lot of people dedicated to this project. And our can supplier worked really closely with us. So, I mean, we're glad we did it. We're happy we are where we are now, and we're always kind of looking to see, well, what's the next best liner? So we're not saying that this is it and we're done. If there's safer materials out there that work, we'll be first in line to try to use them if we can.
I want very quickly to open this up for discussion, but I'm actually kind of hungry to hear whether Amanda Cattermole has anything to add, since you got the chance to speak early in the day. But then there's been a lot, and we've covered a lot of territory. And sort of from the perspective of decision-making and changing materials, you come in the same way that John O'Keefe does, from a brand level, making those choices. Do you have any reflections at this point?
Yeah, I would just agree. It's really complicated. For Levi's, we run thousands of fabrics, and then with those fabrics we'll apply PFCs, or the durable water repellency, in the fabric stage or in the garment stage. And so that all had to be considered. For us, doing the work, doing the trials with a known chemical supplier and a known mill was really critical, and it was really important to do it prior to the product being adopted. So it's all well and good if you really have to get the design piece, that you have to get the trials run prior to line adoption, because once it's been adopted, it's going to market. So we had many, many challenges. Time is always of the essence. We work in the fashion industry. People want things now. They're not willing to wait 3 to 5 years of R&D. So that was a huge issue for us. And then I think the performance piece and the complexity I talked about earlier this morning.
I have questions, but I want to let others have a chance first. So here's a question. Alex?
Thank you. Tom McKeag, Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry. I have a question for John and possibly Amanda. And so far today we've talked, particularly from the business end, about this kind of development being painful and complex and a burden and basically a cost. Can you talk about the value that you got out of it and how this might be a model for translating to other companies who might be considering it? What value did you get out of it? What value might they get out of it? Did it at all contribute to innovation that might put you ahead in the market?
Short answer is yes, but so Amy's Kitchen is still a privately held company, so we don't have any stockholders to report to. So believe it or not, we never really saw it as a burden. It was exciting to us to be able to do this for the consumers that were asking for it, and we felt it was the right thing to do. So it was complex, but I don't think anybody saw it as a burden or really the extra cost, which there was some, wasn't really a factor. So the owners kind of gave us free rein. They said they wanted to make this change. Be responsible, but don't worry about the cost. So that part was not really a big issue for us at Amy's either. We were lucky on both those counts. But yeah, there's probably, especially early on, now a few more people are converting. I mean, Campbell's is saying they're going to be converting soon. And there is an advantage for sure, certainly with in retaining our current customers and bringing in others. It's undeniable. I think how much it is or how to quantify it would be hard for me to say. I think there's other attributes of our products that bring people to us, but that could easily be one of them.
And I would just add and say, you know, Levi's is a values-driven company. It's got very, very strong values. It's done amazing work as it relates to sustainability, social issues, environmental issues. And so for Levi's, it was all around protecting brand reputation and its image and minimizing risk, and because it was the right thing to do. So I was working at Levi's during that R&D phase, and I would say that the support that I was given was huge. I mean, nobody was questioning anything. Everybody at the company felt that it was the right thing to do. I think the return on the investment is enormous, absolutely enormous. You're protecting your brand, you're adhering to your values, and you're leading in the marketplace. And at the end of the day, that is incredibly important to the apparel industry for sure. I mean, it's such a competitive industry, and I think Levi's has done a pretty good job of sharing what it's done in an open way, bringing other brands along with it. And I think that they've gained a lot of marketing advantage by doing it.
Anyone else want to say anything about that?
I think this came up in the first panel a little bit, but I just wanted to raise it again in this panel with the bigger group to discuss it. And that is that there is this sort of uncomfortable period of time that arises between when an ingredient sort of comes to attention as a potential concern and the time when there is, the ability, and, we've certainly heard quite a bit about this, the ability to shift. And so there are different strategies, I think, for thinking about that and dealing with it, and we've seen different strategies out there in different sectors. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk about how to sort of get through that period and on into a future that's more positive and less adversarial. And any thoughts on that would be helpful.
Can I make an addendum to that, which is the question I always ask, and I always get the same answer, but I'm going to keep asking it, which is, what would it take to get more companies to tell about the good things they have done after the fact, even? Not even in this interim period, but they do the good deed, and then they're afraid to disclose it because then their consumers will say, well, what were you selling us in the first place? So what would it take for them to be able to tell those stories? And would consortia help with that?
It's a good point, because when those kind of things happen, when transitions like this happen, a company is going to have so much inventory already out there in the supply chain, so much inventory in customer warehouses, and then you roll this out. I think every company has to do it how they see fit, but it's kind of a balancing act, working with your customers and your consumers, really. We found that just being as open about the communication as possible, letting people know they're going to be seeing these new cans, and there is that risk that you could get stuck with a bunch of inventory in epoxy, in this case, because the new one is out there and available. We were able to manage that relatively well, but it's a great point.
We had an issue in the building industry. This comes up a lot, and we're so far down the combative line that I was giving a presentation at Greenville some years ago, and the manufacturer on the panel with me was very proud of his slide of the hood and the fire and manufacturers are the devil written on the slide. And I think when you get to that point, you're conditioned to a place where you don't feel that you can make change, because that's just who you are. At that point, it's the shame game. And in another meeting with the 50-plus leaders, one of the people in the room said, if a manufacturer tells me what's in their product, I know they're lying. And if they don't tell me what's in their product, I know they have something to hide. So that's where we were at. And so when you ask about how do you get past that, I mean, that was a really big, when I ran the Living Building Challenge, I ran that program for its first 5 years. And the red list started, when it was in a draft, 2-pager, the red list started as an elimination list. And what I tried to do is bring the advocacy element to it and make it all about retraining the designers to have a different ask. Asking them, how can you know more about this than I do? How can you help me help my clients have better, healthier places to live, work, and play? And that it took some time. It was a trajectory. We started with literally letter templates, like sign your name here, don't think, just read the thing and we'll figure out the next step. But together with education and outreach, and then seeing tremendous positive results when they came at it from a compassionate place. I mean, we saw manufacturers literally overnight taking out PVC from a product, or eliminating phthalates, not just for the product for the project or that one product, but the entire product line, and saving money doing that. So we saw some wonderful positive outcomes that then fueled more positive exchanges, to the point where now they're taking each other out to lunch. The same people who were not trusting each other before are now spending social time together. So it makes a difference.
So I'm going to have to jump in here and talk a little bit about the advantage of the market stick, as well as the carrot, because, we'd all love to just, hold hands and sing Kumbaya and believe that the market's going to take care of itself without any kind of encouragement from advocacy organizations or consumer-based campaigns and market-based campaigns like the campaign for Safe Cosmetics or Cans Not Cancer or the Dollar Store campaign. I mean, the reason why market-based campaigns emerge, like the Greenpeace campaign that was successful in moving the textile industry, is because most of these industries aren't going to move unless they're given an incentive to move. And the reality, even with your situation, which was so interesting, Eden, because you described the architects as being the consumer, part of your effectiveness was saying to the building materials part of the supply chain, we're not going to spec you. We're not going to specify that we want to use your materials unless you are transparent around the hazards associated with those materials and start to remove the hazards. So there was a stick,
Absolutely.
involved.
There's a balance.
Yeah, in
There has to be a
terms
balance.
of, I think, the conversation you were very successfully engaged in. So I want to speak a little bit to the stick and then how the stick can move toward a carrot. In terms of advocacy efforts, we were engaged, the Breast Cancer Fund and the Ecology Center, Jeff Gerhardt is here from the Ecology Center, with a few other advocacy organizations, Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, the Mind the Store campaign, the Dollar Store campaign, Coming Clean, and Clean Production Action. And we generated a report, it was called the Buyer Beware Report, that actually tested about 200 canned foods for the presence of BPA and BPA alternatives. And the reason we did that is because we had been asking the brands, the national brands, very nicely, very politely, for a number of years, for 3 years, to tell us where BPA is in your canned foods and tell us where it isn't, and be transparent by labeling your cans and sharing safety data. And they were very politely replying with, no thanks, we're not going to be doing that, basically because no one is telling us we have to. And so we decided to do that research ourselves because the industry wasn't giving us the information that consumers were asking for. And we found that information very easily. And that's, I think, one of the messages that advocates are saying to the market, to industries. You need to be transparent because consumers want that transparency. And if you are, you're going to develop the kind of brand loyalty that will sell your product. So there's a real incentive on the other side of that transparency. And if you're still not willing to be transparent, we can find this out anyway. And that's kind of the big sort of, I think, what's the right word? It's not even a conundrum, it's just the absurdity of the lack of transparency that exists within so many industries right now, which is anyone can find out that information, through reverse engineering, through laboratory testing, but consumers shouldn't have to, and that's what we're saying, and that's why we're asking for transparency in terms of ingredient disclosure and safety data. And by running these market campaigns and using a little bit of a stick, we're able to create consumer demand for those asks. And then we get companies like Amy's and Annie's and Hain Celestial and Eden Foods and even ConAgra that decided to go completely BPA-free because that's where they saw the market pushing them. So on the other side of the stick is the carrot. And I just want to say, and I'll stop talking, I run another campaign called the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics that has been working collaboratively with 1,500 cosmetics companies around the country that are making safe cosmetics and personal care products. And they have grown that sector of the cosmetics industry into a $39 billion industry. And that's not chump change. I mean, that's a really significant demonstration of the hypothesis that safe products are not only possible, but they're profitable.
Tom Lent, Healthy Building Network. I'd like to follow up on that interesting discussion with a proposal that actually we need both a carrot and a both. We need 3 things, a carrot, a stick, and a brush. And the brush I'm referring to is the brush you use in curling. That's what I feel like we've done, to a certain extent in the HPD campaign is create both carrots and sticks and then do the curling approach, which is where you brush away at the ice to make that thing that you've pushed. You've pushed that kettle really hard. You've given it a good shove through market signaling, and then you do a lot of brushing to make sure it goes where you want it to go, given the push that you've given it. And that's where things like developing the HPD as a easy one-stop tool was part of our strategy on that to make it easier to get away from the chaos of different people asking different aspects of the questions of transparency in different ways. Give them one simpler way to do it came into play, and where the kind of tools we built at HBN, the data aggregation tools that kind of help them weed their way through the kinds of disclosures about hazard that we're looking for. So I want to reinforce that, and then I want to kind of ask you another question, which may be more directed towards Amanda and John. And though any of you may have, from your interactions with manufacturers, may have a response to this, which is, what are some of the other things that we need? What are the other brushes that we need once we have gotten the right carrot and stick combination of tools that are getting leading firms like Amy's and Valspar to move to get that the rest of the way? And I'm particularly interested, from the ZDHC standpoint of what got the people who didn't have either the budget or the impetus quite yet of Levi's to start following. What do they need to make those next steps? Whether it's data tools like I put together, or whether it's more relational and another aspect.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about ZDHC. So ZDHC stands for Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals. It's a collaborative effort by brands, leading apparel brands. There's about 22 now. And it's been very, very successful. It's been around for about 5 years. It's now an NGO in its own right. And ZDHC is focusing on industry-wide collaborations. So they're looking at standardizing tools and education, and then conformance around what they're calling a manufacturing restricted substance list. So there's this big push that the apparel industry starts working together on solving the big problems. And it's been very, very effective. So they have a standard audit protocol, they have a standard manufacturing restricted substance list, and they are also focusing on a research list. So I think ZDHC has been super successful. They're really leading, and one of the reasons that they're so successful is because all of these brands, or most of them within ZDHC, have made a public commitment, and that public commitment is available on websites. Consumers are aware of it, and so I think that goes a long way. The fact that they have publicly committed to zero discharge of hazardous chemicals by 2020 is forcing them to act pretty quickly. So that's I've maybe answered your question, but just a little bit around ZDHC.
Well, when we made the change, like I said, to the non-BPA can, it was a relatively few consumers that brought it to our attention and were concerned about it. But since the company is the way it is, we just decided to change early on, kind of ahead of all the information that came out later, I'd say. But as far as any other tools to make these changes, it seems like the public education part would drive a lot of companies, because it really is true. I mean, if enough consumers are asking about it, it makes companies change. So I don't know if you went into your typical grocery store today and asked 50 consumers if they're worried about BPA, how many would say anything? If 30 of them said they were, then I don't think we'd be talking about epoxy cans anymore. So I think that public education part is really important. I mean, for all kinds of things. We have a group of people at Amy's that are very proactive. Their job is to essentially look over the horizon for all these things that are coming up in industry to see how and if they can impact Amy's or our ingredients or the quality of our products or anything. So we do try to be proactive about it, and I'm sure other companies are the same way, maybe some to more or less than extent. But I think the public education part of it can really drive a lot of these changes. Because I don't know who mentioned it, but some companies, if they don't feel they need to make the change, they won't. I mean, even if it's the right thing to do, they might not.
And that's where I'd like to chime in, because I like to think that the regulators actually are a pretty effective brush. At some point, when enough manufacturers have proven that a certain chemical isn't necessary, that there are alternatives, that they're viable, that they're already in manufacturing, it becomes harder and harder for other manufacturers to argue that it can't be done. And sometimes it takes the regulator to say, get to it. We always talk about leveling the playing field, and that's exactly what that is.
I have just one more quick brush, and that is I think Eva was talking a little bit about this. I mean, back in the day when I was much younger, I did believe there was only one kind of a corporation, and I think, you know, there are some people that still believe, you know, business equals bad, you know, or selfish, or just, you know, or self-interest. And I have really, over the last decade, seen, I think we've all seen the growth of a sustainable business community that really cares, you know, that really cares about protecting public health, that cares about saving the planet, that cares about a different bottom line. And so more and more advocacy organizations aren't afraid of saying, support Clean Canteen, for example. I'm not doing a commercial for Clean Canteen, but you know, they were one of the first companies that actually moved away from polycarbonate water bottles to stainless steel. And we're not afraid to say, that's a good company. That's a company that practices, you know, safe chemistry. So I think that's another brush. You know, I'm not saying we should be marketing agents, you know, for companies, but I certainly think that corporate sustainability is the flip side of the coin of, you know, of whatever's on the other side.
And I would just add and say social media is also a fantastic brush. It doesn't take many consumers to spread good and bad messages very quickly. And I think that that's really made brands look a little bit more closely around their practices and their transparency. So social media has been very, very powerful. It's an incredibly powerful tool.
That's for sure. I mean, you look at any company's crisis management plan now, and that'll be in there.
Yep, absolutely.
So yeah, and I do agree. Like regulatory, definitely, especially now it seems, is really pushing. I mean, with FSMA, obviously, I don't know how many people are familiar with FSMA, but I'm kind of involved in that, and the new nutrition facts panel changes that are coming out, or the new guidance on lowering sodium. I mean, I think FDA has been very active in getting people to not only getting companies to make safer food, but getting people to eat right and make the right choices. And I think that's a good thing. I support it, and even though, like, for our company, it's a major change to change all of our labels, but I think it's great because it really focuses on things for people to read a label and understand what's healthy for them.
Yeah, one other point, I mean, and I know that you've seen this with the HPD too, is that the manufacturers themselves, not just in terms of doing the right thing, but then getting a higher quality of information, is that the manufacturers tend to police each other, particularly with the HPD because it's self-declared, right? And so if one manufacturer is getting a lot of light because they're, you know, the first ones to put an HPD out in their particular product sector, and another company of the same product category knows that it cannot be made without certain things, well, what are they going to do? They put out an HPD with more information, and then they say, and then they go around explaining why the other company is misrepresenting their product. So they kind of are acting they're acting as sticks, but it's also a brush because it's honing better, you know, towards better information and higher quality content.
I know there's a question here.
Thanks for all the good discussion. So in summary, that's what I was thinking. This is called sharing is caring. I learned it actually from UC Berkeley too. So this is to Eden. Thanks for your presentation. I didn't know that the HPD actually have a section on nanomaterials. And I just want to find out more on that, like how this information is useful, because nanomaterials has a lot of data gap. Okay, that's one thing. Second, how many companies actually disclose they have nanomaterial? And thirdly, related to that, how would a building contractor or architect use such information?
So the nanomaterial, in some ways, I wouldn't call it a placeholder, but it's starting a conversation. Is it classified as a nanomaterial? Yes, no, or unknown. And at this point, we could say that it's a precautionary step, right? Some people have much more strong opinions on nanomaterials than others. There's strong opinions on both sides. And back when I was working on Living Building Challenge, we also asked about nanomaterials from a precautionary perspective because, you know, it's a concern that we don't know enough about. Now, as far as how many people were marking it, I'd say I saw a lot more unknowns than I saw yeses or nos. And that's a good indicator of a place for increased advocacy, increased education, increased outreach, and this knowledge generally for the consumer and the manufacturer. As far as what do what are the consumers, the building contractors, and the architects doing with this? So that's one of the biggest questions we get from the manufacturers, actually. They're just going to take this piece of paper, check a box, and put it in a drawer. And you know what? Some of them do that. And others are actually taking the data line item by line item, each prompt, and putting it, you know, have an overlay of some healthy algorithms, and are determining what products they're going to specify. So it's everywhere in between. I'd argue, as I was saying before, that if a consumer asks the question, even if they don't know what everything means, that's not necessarily the role that they're playing. They're playing the role of the instigator to get the manufacturer to take a look at what they're doing and hopefully make some changes along the way. And so I think there's a place for the architect or the building contractor to just be asking for it, saying, we care about health. And on the other side, you know, being able to take that information and really start using it for their own apple-to-apple comparisons, for their own priority list. You know, the reason with one of the things I like about the HPD is that it's not apple-to-apple comparison in and of itself. It just gives the information, and then you have to put your own overlay of what you care about on top of it. And I think that could be, you know, really powerful for the architect as well.
While the microphone is moving over to the next question, I just wanted to point out something that's been sort of sticking in my mind as I hear this almost contradiction between what we hear as one of the most influential movers or forces in the marketplace, which is consumers, whether it's architects or soup eaters or jeans wearers, are particularly motivating to the brands or the specifiers to seek new materials and to drive change, while in response, in the little green cards that everybody filled out, the majority said the key influential points were really high in the supply chain, really at the point of design. And I'm just struck by that difference. And in a way, I think it's because we're sort of responding to different questions. One is like, where would we like to see the change happen? And the other is, where do we see it happen? But that sort of gap intrigues me. So we don't have to have any responses to it now, but there was a microphone in transit, and I want to make sure the question gets asked.
Hi, this is Catherine again from Center for Environmental Health. I guess my question is regarding, in particular, Amy's Kitchen, and I probably should know this, but I'm wondering, in particular, with respect to your non-BPA cans, whether or not you actually label that, and as such, so that you can share that information with the consumers. And I think more generally than for the broader panel, at what point do you share that information publicly, that you've made this great change and you're promoting it in a way that it's going to make your product more successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do label our cans. There were some products that got through the trials more quickly simply because we started them earlier. And those cans we changed without labeling until we started labeling when we were ready to make the full conversion. But if consumers called us and asked us, we provided information to consumers who asked about which soups were and which soups weren't, and we gave them lot numbers. So that was the kind of medium we struck. And then before we actually fully started labeling as well, we started putting information on our website also. So we figured that was the best way to balance it. For people that were really concerned, they could call us and we could tell them. And then towards the end, when we knew we were going to convert the last group of products, then we did that, and we got them into the supply chain, and then we started to label. And then we had some pretty interesting discussions about what that label would actually say, because there's all kinds of different ways to say that. So I'm sure other manufacturers had those exact same discussions.
Where did you end up?
We ended up with non-BPA liner. Another popular one is no BPA intent, because it's really gets down to, we're a litigious society. So yeah, and some people say BPA free, which some suppliers aren't comfortable with. So yeah, it was just part of labeling. If you're in the labeling world, which I've been in now for 2 years in my new job, it's like every letter, everything you say, you have to just really scrutinize it, because all the claims, most of the claims are regulated and everything else. And if they're not regulated, there could be litigation or whatever. You know, there's all kinds of risks that have to be addressed when you're doing a conversion like this that have nothing to do maybe with chemistry.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, and this doesn't have anything to do with Levi's, but I do quite a lot of claim strategies with my clients, and we tend not to put chemical-free or PFC-free on consumer labels attached to the product. There's more information on the website, and I think greenwashing is a real concern, and the substantiation of any claims that you're going to make. So I think the more conservative route is to gradually tell the story on your website rather than putting specific claims and marketing on the product from a textile perspective.
So I'd like to get back to canned foods for a second, because that we were very excited to see that Amy's were labeling their cans BPA free, and that is what the advocacy community has been asking for. But there's a part 2 to that information disclosure request, and that is, what are you using instead? And again, in the case of Amy's, they were very forthcoming and transparent to us, to the Breast Cancer Fund, and told us what they were using instead. But we're asking the sort of royal we that manufacturers label the packaging additive that they're using, and because BPA-free describes the absence of something, but we're interested in what are you using instead. And I mean, there's lots of reasons why, but one of, I think, the most compelling reasons is that the FDA regulates packaging additives the same way that they regulate food ingredients. They're described as food contact substances, indirect food additives, because of their ability to migrate into the food material itself. So that is a big ask in terms of transparency, that you're using acrylic now instead, that your label should say, you know, this packaging is made with acrylic. And I think Valspar is planning on being transparent with the TMBPF, or maybe you'll have I think Valspar Pure, maybe you'll have a fancier name as well on product packaging, right, Mark?
Well, Valpure is the name, and it covers acrylics and everything.
Oh, okay, so that's not quite what I'm referring to.
I just want to say that what he said, which is that Valpure is the name, but it isn't specific to the coating material.
All right, so that's not exactly what we're looking for. Just to be clear.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I guess more of a comment, and it actually segues pretty well with what you guys were just talking about, and that's labeling. So my comment is, and maybe it's an age thing, or maybe it's as a relatively a new dad, is kind of the looking at labels more carefully, especially on consumer products, the labels themselves being very powerful and sort of stating what they don't have. You know, so instead of, to your point, you know, includes this, or even in apparel wear, outdoor apparel, I do see some branding when it comes to, you know, using this, you know, Gore-Tex alternatives or whatnot, but especially on cleaning products and other things, I am kind of amazed at the length of label that's taken up by dash-free or does not contain. It's interesting.
Reflections on tension? I mean, I respect that it's can be a very complicated thing to get into, to explain what material you are using and why you're using it. and that there might not be room for that on a label. And I think that's sort of a difficult trade-off and attention. It's much easier to say BPA-free than it is to explain the thinking behind the alternative.
Yeah, this is a little more common to that too. I don't know how many people actually live in San Francisco, but I've been getting quite a bit of feedback from consumers to throw away their material due to the fact that certain new thing came out because it's free, certain thing is free, BPA free, so they keep throwing out the old stuff. And it creates a society that you keep throwing out stuff when you create new alternative that is better. And there's a trend going on. And we see that all the time in the waste industry. And one of the good things is cleaning products. When Clorox make up 4 different kind of cleaning products out there is organic, just label by organic. People throw away all the other old stuff. So, this is a brand issues, but also about what is the right label. Because if you look at all the ingredient, like Breast Cancer Fund actually did research, same thing like me, I told my guy to do research. The ingredient inside is basically the same, they just change the percentage. And then they can label as organic. And then, bam, it goes to the market and people just react to it. And then they throw away their quote-unquote legacy product that is not more than a year old. So, choosing a right term on your label could change the consumer behavior.
Well, we know there's certainly industry to industry or product type to product type. It depends a lot on how something is regulated, how much information has to be provided about ingredients or identity of ingredients. Did you have a question?
Yeah, it was more so like a comment too, and I think, as Janet was mentioning, the advocacy community is really pushing for more transparency across various product lines, and while I can appreciate the sharing of that information on the website because it is complex, I know that one thing we've been hearing from our partners that there still is a significant digital divide and not everybody is able to access that information online, and hence, especially for those communities who don't have access to internet and websites, that labeling that kind of information on the product is really important for especially low-income consumers who oftentimes are bearing a disproportionate impact of chemical exposure. So I just thought it would be appropriate, time given the various manufacturers in the audience to understand that, there's still not that equity in terms of access to information, and we know that a lot of the communities we work with that are low income are still wanting that information, and on label is what we've heard is the best.
Yeah, it's a good comment because that is a controversial part of the GMO labeling bill that passed recently, where one of the labeling alternatives is a QR code or a telephone number. So they don't necessarily have to label, and that was a contentious decision that was made. It kind of trumped the Vermont law. Yeah. Some call it the Dark Act. But yeah. So anyway, it got the labeling, it passed that part of it, but like you said, one of the 4 alternatives to doing that would be a QR code, and you need to at least have a cell phone that can scan that to understand if there's GMOs in that product.
I just want to put in a second plug for one of the items that Kristen mentioned today about CPDAT, which is this new database that's coming on that will have more information about product ingredients and potential function of various chemicals. And it is a real challenge within the Safer Consumer Products Program to try to find the product ingredients so that we know that we're listing priority products properly. And so any tools that come along that help with the information about product design and product formulation are really critical to us.
So I think Meredith just answered her portion of my question. We have 5 minutes, so I just wanted to have sort of a lightning round of your one thing. If you could change one thing, and you might have many things that you would like to change, but if you could change one thing that would help facilitate decision making around whatever part of whatever sector you know most about, in terms of identifying or evaluating or implementing alternative materials, what would you most like to change? What would make that so much easier? You don't have to go in order.
You're right. I stand pat. I'm good.
You're not going to change your answer.
I'll add one. I mean, there's plenty, but one that immediately comes to mind is bringing in Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5, Tier N suppliers into this conversation, because we talk to the manufacturers in our advocacy, and from what I've heard from Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier N folks is that they don't get the memo. Tier 2 will get the invite to the lunch and learn or to the training, but after that it gets lost in translation, sometimes actually lost in translation. But if we could activate that far up the supply chain, it's not then just helping the food industry or the building industry or the apparel industry, because it's all the same. At some point it becomes more of a pure form, and so we can hopefully move faster.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. It's simplicity in education. How do we simplify the information, and how do we educate the Tier 3 and Tier 4 suppliers so information's not getting lost in translation?
Well, and I guess I've got two words, accountability and leadership. It just really boggles my mind that some of the biggest brands in the world, the biggest consumer products companies, like literally tell us they can't get their suppliers to do what they want them to do. And I'm just like, what? As my 6-year-old daughter would go, what the? Like how is that possible? Seriously, that Unilever can't get their fragrance suppliers to tell them the ingredients in their fragrance, or Procter & Gamble, the world's biggest consumer products company, basically, says the same thing. And, we've got some of the biggest national brands, Campbell's, Del Monte. They seriously can't get their supply chain to give them the information that they need, the full chemistry and safety data, so they can transfer that same level of transparency to consumers. If that's not possible, there is a real problem. And I know that's what we're here to discuss, but a lot of the people that should be in the room today are participating via webcast. And that's not going to cut it, Like the real people that have the potential to be a part of the solution need to be in the room. They need to be a part of the conversation. And and they also need to understand they're buying consumer loyalty. They're developing that brand loyalty by being a part of the conversation and flexing their market muscle and saying to their suppliers, you know what, if you can't get with the picture, we're going to have to move on and find another supplier that will. And those suppliers, like Valspar, will start to attract more they will become more profitability. And at the end of the day, I think that's what the supply chain wants. The brands want to sell more product. So everyone just needs to get on board. And I think a big part of this is around information flow, and it's around accountability, absolutely, all the way along the supply chain. But it's also about flexing that market muscle. And the big brands just, standing up and saying, this is the way it's going to be, get on board, or, or what's the other half of that? I'm so bad with metaphors.
Fish or cut bait.
Fish or cut bait. Thank you.
Well, I agree with all that was just said, and I know there's still a lot of controversy or conflicting science about whether or not BPA is dangerous or BPA liners are dangerous, but I think we're assuming that there's enough evidence to say that it's reasonable to think that. And I've always felt that just industry-wide throughout the supply chain that food safety should never be seen as a competitive advantage. And I think if everybody on board could say, I think if we could agree to that, from the coating makers to the can suppliers to the canneries and whatever supply chain you're looking at, that, yeah, this is not a competitive advantage. We all have to work together on food safety issues. You know, your flavor profiles, if you put spices that you're not labeling all of them on your label, I get that, as long as you're addressing the food safety issues. I don't think anybody should see that, try to make that an advantage.
On that note, I want to thank all of our speakers and panel members and facilitators, everyone who helped put this together and who thought of the ideas, Cali PA and OEHA and DTSC and NTP, and who contributed by coming and providing their expertise, and all of you, both in the room and online, who contributed to the day. Thank you very much. And I also wanted to say that give us a week or two, but we will post the presentations and the recording of this webinar on the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry website, and we will send out an email to everyone who registered for the conference when we do that. So you'll get an email with a link to all of that information online. And hopefully I've just saved my inbox a whole bunch of messages by letting everybody know that. And I want to let Dr. Lauren Zeiss have the last word.
Yeah, just as a last word, I also want to really thank the center for just a wonderful program. When we came to you with this desire to discuss alternatives, you really kind of changed our mind on the thinking about how to approach this issue. And you've just done such a beautiful job facilitating this meeting. So we thank you very much.